Today's hearing comes at a crucial moment in this committee's investigation into the Biden administration's catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. For months after President Biden announced the withdrawal, his senior military advisors and his own intelligence community repeatedly issued dire warnings about the damage this would create. At the same time, I, along with other Republican and Democrat members of Congress, urged President Biden to uphold the conditions of the Doha Agreement. And most importantly, we urged him to prepare for the eventual fallout of our withdrawal. He ignored us and all, including his own State Department personnel, who issued a dissent cable in July warning of the dire situation on the ground. Instead, as the Taliban takeover became imminent, the White House and State Department leadership stuck their heads in the sand. It was so bad, the State Department waited until the day after the Taliban captured Kabul to actually request an emergency evacuation, also known as a NEO. As a result of the Biden administration's failure to plan, the U.S. military was forced to conduct this emergency evacuation surrounded by tens of thousands of Taliban terrorists. Put simply, President Biden and Secretary Blinken put thousands of American lives at risk through their incompetence and willful blindness. And then the worst possible outcome, a terrorist attack at Abbey Gate on August 26, 2021 that killed 13 U.S. service members, wounded 45 more, and killed more than 170 Afghan civilians. It was the deadliest day for the United States in Afghanistan in over a decade. And today, we have some of the family members of the service members killed at Abbey Gate in the audience. They're here because they want accountability for their children's deaths. I'm going to get them the answers they deserve. I anticipate my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will attempt to spin this disaster as all being President Trump's fault. They will claim the Doha Agreement forced President Biden to withdraw and that he had no choice. But this is false. To that end, I want to remind everyone of two critical facts. First, the Doha Agreement was conditions-based. Conditions our witnesses here today negotiated. And as he can tell you, those conditions were not being met by the Taliban, and they are still not being met today. The Taliban is allowing terrorists like al-Qaeda to flourish in Afghanistan. And the truth is that President Biden wanted to withdraw from the Doha Agreement. And if he wanted to, he could have. He did just that with many of President Trump's other agreements, like Remain in Mexico. Second, President Biden himself said that even if the Doha Agreement had never been signed, he would still have withdrawn all U.S. troops from Afghanistan exactly the way that he did. When asked by George Stephanopoulos, quote, he said, would you have withdrawn troops like this even if President Trump had not made that deal with the Taliban? President Biden replied, quote, I would have tried to figure out how to withdraw those troops, yes. Our witness today, Ambassador Khalilzad, someone I've known for quite many years, served as a U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan reconciliation under President Trump, where he negotiated the Doha Agreement and was asked to remain on by President Biden. In November 2023, Ambassador Khalilzad appeared before the committee for a nearly 12-hour closed-door transcribed interview, and voluntarily, I might add, and we thank you for that. And in that interview, one thing was made clear. The core problem was not the Doha Agreement. It was a president who refused to enforce it. I want to thank our witness for being here today. Ambassador Khalilzad, I believe you have valuable information to share with this committee. And I know you've chosen to do so voluntarily, and I hope you do so with the same candor you showed in November. And I really admire you, sir. You're not forced to appear here. We could have done that. You're doing this as a patriot and an American, and someone who is in the middle of all this from the very beginning with so many facts to share with this committee. We thank you, sir, for being here today. With that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin by also thanking you for hearing my call for transparency. at our November 2023 Afghanistan hearing. Yesterday, your staff sent us written notice of your personal commitment to publicly release all transcripts from interviews held during this Congress and in the committee's investigation into the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan after they are finalized on February 29th. This indeed is the right thing to do. The American people have funded our bipartisan oversight work, and we owe them full transparency, not just misleading, cherry-picked snippets. Such transparency is critical for any investigation. So I strongly hope that your commitment to make transcripts public will extend to the other oversight investigations you've initiated in this Congress in which witnesses have been questioned behind closed doors. We must not let this committee's activities become another typical move in a partisan game. And with that, let me thank Ambassador Calazard for appearing before our committee. Ambassador, you served under 3 different presidents in a variety of capacities during America's 20 years of war and effort in Afghanistan. And your insights on the August 2021 withdrawal and the many decision points that led to the events of August 2021 are important to this committee's understanding. A 20-year war deserves comprehensive and bipartisan oversight. But the title of this hearing, How the Biden Administration Failed to Enforce the Doha Agreement, is telling. It is not titled The Biden Administration's Failed Doha Agreement with the Taliban. That is because it was not Joe Biden who crafted the February 2020 deal. It was, in fact, his Republican predecessor that made the agreement with the Taliban that committed the United States to withdraw all of our troops from Afghanistan. Nor is the hearing titled, How the Trump administration failed to press the Taliban to live up to its commitments in the Doha Agreement, but withdrew troops anyway. That would require scrutiny of the Doha deal since its inception under the Trump administration. I must say this because for some of my Republican colleagues, the challenges of Afghanistan began the day of Joe Biden's inauguration. That is not to say that the Biden administration is beyond congressional review or that there is nothing to learn from those 8 months. But that is an 8-month snapshot out of 20 years. At best, this fixation is oversight malpractice. At worst, it is historical revisionism, politically motivated to place the withdrawal with which President Biden inherited solely at his feet. Let's be clear. Both President Biden and President Trump sought to end our forever war in Afghanistan, and President Biden ultimately achieved that goal. Our presence in Afghanistan has changed, but our core interests have not. And the United States continues to pursue those interests, as it has demonstrated with the killing of the emir of al-Qaeda and a key 9/11 mastermind, Ahmad Izawi, in 2022 in Kabul. This is not about pointing blame. This is about grappling with reality, with the facts we like, as well as the ones we don't, and with the sacred constitutional responsibility we have to oversee the State Department and the U.S. foreign policy. To that end, I want to acknowledge Ambassador Dan Smith's statement, which is submitted for today's record. Ambassador Smith served for almost 4 decades at the State Department and returned at Secretary Blinken's request to lead its after-action review, an independent review of the department's actions over the course of January 2020 to August 2021, related to the United States withdrawal. The results of his review, drawn from more than 150 interviews, are not just invaluable, but actionable, and provide a roadmap we all should consult regularly to support the department's crisis management capacity and its single greatest assets, its people. Now, Ambassador Calazar, I know you have previously sat for a transcript interview on today's subject that lasted over 10 hours, and we thank you for that. That's a testimony to both your vast knowledge to share and your deep commitment to America and to our national security. So I look forward to your testimony And I hope that the American people can hear today what we have already heard behind closed doors. And with that, I yield.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have here today the Honorable Zalmay Khalilzad before us today. He served as a special representative for Afghanistan reconciliation at the State Department from September 18 to October 2021. Your full statement will be made part of the record. I now recognize Ambassador Khalilzad for his opening statement.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and distinguished members of the committee, I welcome the opportunity to talk with you today about America's strategy in Afghanistan during my service as the special between 2018 and 2021. In September 2018, the Trump administration asked me to help negotiate a framework agreement for the safe withdrawal of U.S. forces, obtain commitments from both the Taliban and the Afghan government on U.S. counterterrorism concerns, and set the stage for Afghans to start negotiating an end to the war in their country. By the end of 2018, the President's decision was to bring the American forces home. Several factors that contributed to this decision. The conclusion that this war had gone on for too long with no end in sight. The opportunity cost was too high. The United States needed to focus on great power competition, that is China, Russia, and the threat from Iran. Afghanistan no longer was central to the war on terror. The goal of transforming Afghanistan into a modern and democratic state had been unrealistic. Despite best efforts, the country had huge governance problems and rampant levels of corruption. The administration recognized the potential risks involved in this policy. The greatest risk was the potential threat to U.S. forces during withdrawal. The British withdrawal in 1842 and the Soviet withdrawal in 1988 and 1989 had been very bloody. A second risk was Afghanistan once again becoming the big platform for a terrorist threat against the United States homeland, U.S. interests, and our allies. A third risk was the loss of gains to this policy, both inside the government and outside. But the President determined that the withdrawal was in the U.S. national interest. After more than a year of negotiations, on February 29, 2020, we reached two agreements, one with the Taliban and the other with the Afghan government. These provided a framework for U.S. withdrawal, dealing with terrorism, intra-Afghan negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan Republic, a permanent ceasefire, and future relations between the United States and Afghanistan. Key features of the agreement were phased withdrawal of U.S. forces over a 14-month period. Afghanistan was not to be used by any group or individual to threaten the security of the United States and its allies. Intra-Afghan negotiations. Importantly, the Taliban committed not to attack U.S. forces once the agreement was signed. This was critical, and the Taliban adhered to it, killing no coalition fighter or U.S. soldier during the entire withdrawal period. The first phase of withdrawal lasted 135 days, in which the U.S. forces were reduced to 8,600. By the time President Trump left office, U.S. forces in Afghanistan had been reduced to 2,500. The U.S. retained the right to come to the defense of the Afghan forces if the Taliban attacked them. We exercised this right as needed. During the negotiations between the Afghan Republic and the Taliban, which started on September 12, 2020, they did not make any significant progress. After the November 2020 elections, President-elect Biden's team asked me to stay on. The administration had three options. One, withdraw from the Doha Agreement. Two, implement the agreement, but with changes such as the extension of the agreed timeline, linking the withdrawal of remaining forces to the conclusion of a political agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government, or insisting on leaving behind in Afghanistan a counter-terror force, or withdraw the remaining forces without such linkages. The President announced in April of 2021 that we would add 4 months to the timetable for withdrawal, for a total of 18 months. The withdrawal was not conditioned on a political agreement between the two Afghan sides because it was believed that such conditionality would risk a return to war without end and entrap the United States into reversing course and sending more forces again. It was also decided that our over-the-horizon capabilities would allow us to monitor and respond to terror threats to the U.S. from Afghan territory. On protecting social and political gains, the approach was to advocate for key values in the course of inter-Afghan negotiations by pressing the Taliban on respecting women's rights and human rights. The withdrawal proceeded based on the new extended timeline. The assessment was that the Afghan government would remain in power and its forces would defend it and fight the Taliban during the withdrawal for some time afterwards. This assumption informed our plans. Although reasonable, the assumption turned out to be wrong. The situation on the ground began to shift significantly and rapidly in favor of the Taliban. They took over one province after another, and by mid-August of 2021, were at the gates of Kabul. We had a last-minute success in persuading the Taliban to refrain from entering Kabul and instead to hold talks with government to reach a political deal for a shared government, a step to which both sides agreed. But this fell apart when President Ghani surprisingly fled the country, which caused the now leaderless Afghan military and police to instantly disintegrate. These developments led to the Taliban entry into Kabul, and this abrupt series of events obliged the U.S. to react, adapt, and improvise, as none of this had been foreseen in our plans to withdraw by the end of August. As we all remember, the final 2 weeks of chaos at the airport and the tragic loss of 13 brave Americans in an ISIS-K terrorist attack were difficult, and what-ifs remain hotly debated. The events of those final days should not diminish the achievements made. We must all remember that after 9/11, we sent our forces to Afghanistan to decimate al-Qaeda there. This was accomplished and represents a major win for the security of the United States. We all are grateful to those whose sacrifice made this possible and to their families. The struggle for Afghanistan is not over, and Afghanistan's final chapter is certainly not written. The seed of the values we planted may well bear fruit over time. It would be a mistake to turn our back on the country. The American approach going forward must take current realities in Afghanistan, the region, and the world into account while remaining guided as elsewhere by our interests and enduring values. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to echo your comments on to our veterans that their service was not in vain. They protected this nation for 20 years from a major terrorist attack like 9/11, and we thank them for that. We also want to thank the parents of Marine Corps Corporal Hunter Lopez and Marine Corps Sergeant Nicole G., who are here today, and to the Lopez family, Ms. Shamlin, and the rest of the Gold Star families. We honor your sacrifice and your children. In November, you testified before this committee in a transcribed interview, and you just restated that you presented to the Biden administration and to the president basically three options on the Doha Agreement. One, to basically ignore it and unconditionally withdraw. Two, to tear it up. And three, to enforce its conditions against the Taliban. You also testified that you and Secretary Blinken both recommended to President Biden that he enforce Doha's condition. But instead, the president ignored your advice or disagreed and chose to ignore the Doha conditions and unconditionally withdraw. Is that correct?
I think there was the opportunity for me to brief the president, that you said, correct, and the options that he had. And it was clear that it would be desirable that the final withdrawal happens after there is an agreement between the government and the Taliban. And that was broadly supported, that idea. But upon discussion and deliberation and consultations with allies and others, and the allies too favored withdrawal after there was an agreement between the government and the Taliban. But there was a judgment that if we did that, since that was not part of the Doha Agreement, and that it could result in a protracted delay in the withdrawal of forces, as we couldn't be certain when and if the Afghans would reach an agreement. And if there was a risk of going back to war and perhaps sending more troops, the decision was not to pursue that, and there was broad support for that decision.
But your recommendation to the president was to enforce Doha's conditions, correct?
That was part of the agreement, yes. And we restated that this was a condition-based agreement. It was a package deal. There were linkages. What we did depended on the Taliban delivering on their commitments.
Right, and the president disagreed with you and chose not to enforce the conditions.
Well, I described the discussion that occurred and the judgment that was made.
And the conditions were not enforced, and as a result, the Taliban's in control of Afghanistan today, correct?
Well, I would say it's clear that the Taliban are in control, but I would put the responsibility for what happened largely on the shoulders of the Afghan government leadership for not standing for their government, for their system, and for the values that they said they believed in.
And I agree. I think President Ghani's actions were cowardice, and fleeing his country is a coward. Not a good example. Let me turn to the meeting you had in Doha between yourself, General McKenzie, and the Taliban leader Mullah Baradar. You said that the Taliban offered to give the United States control of Kabul for the purposes of evacuation, but that offer was turned down. When asked by my committee at your interview whether the Taliban viewed that as a, quote, green light to take over Kabul, you said, quote, I think that's clear. Do you agree with that statement?
I agree that we had made an agreement for the Taliban not to enter Kabul and for a delegation to come from Kabul. President Ghani had agreed to it as well, to negotiate a power-sharing government to take over on September 1 in a meeting of 200 Afghan notables present.
Right. But McKenzie says that's not my mission because his orders are not to secure Kabul for evacuation. His orders are to evacuate by July 4th, and he didn't have the troops allocated for that. Now, he could have raised that to the president. Was this meeting, to your knowledge, ever reported to the White House?
It was reported clearly to the entire government, but it was reported after General McKenzie said on the spot there that that wasn't, as you said, Chairman, his mission to secure Kabul. And the initial goal was for Taliban not to be in Kabul. In fact, it presented them with a map of some 20 to 25 miles away from the center, within that area, that there should be no Talib present. But the departure of President Ghani and increased widespread concern by Afghans in Kabul about law and order, with the disintegration of the security forces, the options were either that, as the Talibs offered, that we take responsibility. And General McKenzie, as you said correctly, Chairman, I was present in the meeting, and that was not part of his mission. And then the discussion shifted to where the Talibs could go for
because his understanding, McKenzie's understanding, that the president wouldn't authorize more troops to take over Kabul for purposes of the evacuation.
Well, I can't comment on that because I wasn't present in any discussion